Let's try this again. Good afternoon. I am Jonathan L. Walton. I am the Plummer Professor of Christian Morals. And as the Pusey minister here, I would like to welcome each and every one of you into Harvard's Memorial Church. This beautiful space was dedicated on Armistice Day, November 11th, 1932, in grateful memory of Harvard students and alums who died in World War I. Since that time, even though the list of names has grown, the Memorial Church has continued to serve as a symbolic center here at the One Harvard Yard. This is why we are committed to making sure that our porch, our classroom space, and our sanctuary remain open and available to the entire Harvard community. Our president, Drew Gilpin Faust, has a slogan that we have all embraced, One Harvard. And we have a saying here: everyone at Harvard may not belong to the Memorial Church, but the Memorial Church belongs to everyone at Harvard. What we do at 11 a.m. on Sunday morning may not be your cup of tea, but we are a site of critical inquiry and a space of grace with a range of educational and entertainment programs 7 days a week. In other words, here at the Memorial Church, we are a place to pursue veritas, truth, and caritas, love and service. This is why I believe that it is appropriate for us to begin today's program inside of these walls. The building, it signifies service, sacrifice, community, and commitment to a cause bigger than oneself. And it is in this spirit of love and service toward an ongoing pursuit of veritas that we welcome you this afternoon. We are honored that you are here. And now, my friends, it's my special privilege to introduce to some and present to others our university campaign co-chair, Jim Rothenberg. Jim just celebrated his 45th reunion from the college, a member of the class of 1968. He also earned his MBA from Harvard Divinity School in 1970. Along with serving as a fellow of the corporation, he has been treasurer of the university since 2004. He, along with his wife Anne, are devoted to Harvard. And the philanthropic light of that devotion illumines this campus in so many remarkable ways. Because of their care, because of their commitment to this university, generations of students will bask in the warm rays of Jim and Anne's generosity. Please, if you will, join me in welcoming our university campaign co-chair, Jim Rothenberg.
Well, Jonathan, thank you for your eloquence and for that very kind introduction. And thank you for welcoming us all here to your Memorial Church. On behalf of the Harvard campaign co-chairs, welcome to Cambridge, welcome to Harvard Yard, and welcome to this important day in Harvard's history. Over the past decade, I have chosen to spend a great deal of my time traveling from Los Angeles, where I live, to Harvard. My assistant tells me that so far, I've made about 170 round trips in that period of time. And I have chosen to spend a great deal of my philanthropy on Harvard as well. I'm in the investment business, and it's hard to find a better investment than Harvard. As an undergraduate, I studied English. It fostered in me a continuing love of reading and literature, And over my years of association with Harvard, Ann and I have supported the humanities as well as many other aspects of the university. I am particularly moved by Drew Faust's vision of one Harvard, a Harvard in which we cross boundaries in research and teaching, we create and share knowledge, and we have impact across many fields, from literature to the world's religions, to the development of new energy sources, to global health and discoveries in neurosciences as just some examples. Harvard is a wonderful mixture of traditional values and emerging opportunities, and there is an exciting and growing sense of creativity on this campus. Traditional values, excellence, and innovation. That is a package worthy of our support. It's my pleasure today to start this celebration, launching the Harvard campaign, by introducing 5 faculty members from various fields who will be discussing the future of knowledge, teaching, and learning. Fittingly, the discussion will be moderated by Jonathan Zittrain, whose many university roles include Professor of Law at Harvard Law School and the Harvard Kennedy School, Professor of Computer Science at the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences, and co-founder and director of the Berkman Center for Internet and Society. And with all that, I just want you to know he's a very young man. With Professor Zittrain, our 4 eminent faculty members, you will find their biographical information in your folders. So please join me in welcoming them this afternoon: Jonathan Zittrain, Rebecca Henderson from the Harvard Business School, Peter Sorger from the Harvard Medical School, Alison Simmons from the Faculty of Arts and Sciences, and Hopi Hoekstra from the Faculty of Arts and Sciences and the Museum of Comparative Zoology. Please enjoy what will undoubtedly be a fascinating session. Thank you.
Go on. Thank you very much, Jim, Jonathan. Good afternoon, everybody. Boy, you're still not warmed up yet. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. All right. So Jim, in his day job, I gather, is charged with knowledge of the future. We are going to be talking about the future of knowledge, a small topic. And we have 4 folks spanning a great kaleidoscope of disciplines to help us talk about it. So first, let's meet Hopi Hoekstra. Hopi, you're an evolutionary geneticist, is that right?
That's right.
And from your bio, it says that you study the genetic basis of adaptation and speciation in vertebrates. For those of us not already skilled in the art, tell us what that means.
So maybe one simple way to say this is that I'm interested in the DNA base pair changes that make us better reproduce and survive in wild populations. We tend to study things like wild mice as our model system. Is that helpful?
So can people bring you samples?
We take samples, the museum's filled with drawers. And
so if you have spare wild mice, bring them.
You know where to go.
That's the basic idea. And would you say you do basic science or applied science, or is that even a meaningless distinction?
I identify with basic science. We're happy if the work that we produce has some translational implications, but I think motivated primarily by basic science.
Great. And how would you say the way in which knowledge is generated in your field has either changed in the past 20 years or you anticipate might change in the next 20?
I think, in thinking about this question, I can think back to my dissertation, which hopefully I can convince you it wasn't that long ago. And I would say that I could generate the data that made up my somewhat hefty dissertation probably in about a month now. So the thing in my field I think that's changed the most is just our ability to generate data. So in the field of genomics, for example, when I was a graduate student, we didn't have a complete genome sequence. Now we can do this for approximately $1,000 for the human genome, and it can take just a few weeks, and this is mind-blowing.
And I gather this doesn't make dissertations happen more quickly now. It means there's a higher bar for a dissertation.
I think that's right.
It's too bad, that. Great. Professor Alison Simmons, greetings. And you are, I think, put simply, a philosopher.
I am.
Tell us about your work.
I work both on the theory of mind. What is it that makes us creatures with a mind? What's the relationship between mind and brain, mind and world? But I also do most of that work in the context of the history of philosophy. So I work on 17th and 18th century thinkers who actually had some very interesting things to say about this. So those are the things I think about.
And how has the way in which your field or subfield conducts its work changed?
In much the way that Hopi said her field has changed. Back when I was a graduate student, people to do their research had to go find texts in archives. They had to travel to Paris. Unfortunately, I no longer have to travel to Paris to do my research. Texts are available online. So I can spend more of my time trying to figure out what they mean and not traveling to find
And for some of the most fundamental philosophical questions, say that of ethics, do you still see it then as possible that we could have a breakthrough, that somebody over a couple buildings away could say, Eureka, now at last we know it's okay to hurt a puppy, and here's the figures to prove it. Could that happen?
Eureka moments. I think conceptual changes are what we can do. We can have a eureka moment where we think, oh, wait a minute, this isn't the right way to think about the relationship between causation and moral responsibility, say. That we can have. I don't think we're going to solve any particular question. I hope we never get to the point where it's okay to hurt puppies. But.
Got it. And at least we have one thing clear on the panel so far.
That's
a good takeaway. Yes, exactly. Mice is a different story, I understand.
Sorry.
And you also identify with Team Basic rather than Team Applied?
I do. I work in the basic humanities.
The basic humanities.
The basic. So we were talking about this earlier, Jonathan. Colleagues of mine spent a lot of time working on the concept of causation. What is it for something to be the cause of something else? And you might think, oh my God, ivory tower. But then people in law have to think seriously about what it is for someone to cause an event.
Yes.
Can somebody not doing something count as the cause of something else? Because you have to assign moral responsibility.
Yes. So
law
as applied philosophy.
Law as applied philosophy. Yes.
Very good. Thank you. Rebecca Henderson, an economist, and you study, I guess, how organizations respond to large technological shifts.
That's right. And the answer is badly.
But you're here to help.
I'm here to help. I was Eastman Kodak Professor of Management for many years of my career, and that's pretty much what I did and what I do. I work with very large organizations that see major shifts coming in their environment and are trying to respond.
And how do you study what you study, and how does that change over time with large technological shifts?
Oh, so it's interesting listening to my colleagues. I mean, in business, the world has got a lot more complicated. When I started 25, 30 years ago, you could pretty much study US corporations working in the US and you'd be okay. And now you can't study business unless you're global, unless you're working with organizations, 150, 200,000 people. So here's the question. How do you study an organization that large and that complicated and come out with anything that means anything? So we're still working on that one. But the easy answer is research has got both much more focused and precise, because we have huge data sets now and better techniques. And simultaneously, we're searching for ways to get inside these corporations and hang out with them and feel what it's like. And trying to keep those two things in balance is the name of the game.
And you seem very much then Team Applied.
I'm very applied.
You're applied, not basic. And do you tend to generate testable propositions, to put it in science terms? Are the predictions that you or your field might make things that you could look back and say, we got this right, we got that wrong?
Yes, sort of.
Do you want to unpack that?
So yes, we can generate testable propositions about narrow things. The trouble is they're the less interesting questions. So generating testable propositions about the more interesting questions, that's much harder.
Got it. Great, thank you. So Peter Sorger, biochemist is one of the hats you wear, is that right?
That's right.
You have a lab of at least 26 people.
Yes, that would not be atypical for my profession.
I wasn't going anywhere with that. I see that as a plus rather than
This isn't a discussion about space.
Some things are eternal. And tell us what you study. Molecular lesions sounds like something unusual.
Well, I'm basically a cancer biologist, and my lab perhaps is unusual in trying to combine a mixture of sort of the more traditional tools of biology with computation. So we do a lot of computational analysis and modeling. And among the things we look at, of course, in the case of cancer, is what are the lesions in our genome which cause disease, because what we know about cancer is ultimately the enemy is ourselves gone awry. So hence the lesion component. It would be very much related to Hopi's interest in genetics, but here the genetics of the development of human disease rather than organismal evolution.
So you're very much an applied side of the facet of Hopi's basic side of looking into things. Is that right?
I know you asked me that earlier,
yes.
And I have to say that I wasn't, I don't think of myself as an applied scientist at all, and I can tell you when we go to funding agencies, they often say not applied at all. It looks awfully theoretical to me, which is not a good thing in that context. So we tend to think actually a more effective definition is not between applied and basic in the biomedical sciences, but actually between programmatic and curiosity-driven. Huh. And that is to say that we have an increasing tendency to look for programmatic research. Resources are tight. The agendas have to be set, ideally by panels of very intelligent and senior leadership, and then we follow that agenda. Whereas in fact, the history of science has shown that pure curiosity-driven research, often by small numbers of individuals, has a bigger impact on major problems than programmatic research. So I think that's a more effective division.
Well, that's a great lead-in to another kind of cluster of topics around this, which I guess as Rebecca was telling us that companies have gotten far more complex over time, in part because technology has made it easy for that to be so. The relationship between the spheres of academia and the corporate world have, I think, gotten more intertwined. And I'm curious for impressions about how to balance or even allocate the work that humanity ought to be doing between the spheres of academia and the corporate sphere, or blended. And so maybe just back to you, Peter, have you encountered those kinds of issues?
Yeah, so it's interesting, sort of biomedical research is really in the middle of one of those once every 100-year revolutions. So it is it's among the physical sciences, it's historically been the least quantitative. It's very much about storytelling, drawing diagrams, pictures. The first area that became highly quantitative was genomics, and now that concept is spreading across biomedicine, and that's faced us with the fundamental question, what does it mean to know something? Hitherto, it's been to publish a paper somewhere, draw a picture, figure 7, because all our papers have 7 figures, and that's some drawing of the output. Now, the question is, in a field that's not dominated by theory, unlike physics, we're not dominated by theory, is what is that? And increasingly, we see that as a form of computation. Corporations are extraordinarily poorly suited to deal with a shift in what it means to know something.
Yes.
They can take what it means to know in one paradigm and do it very well, but when the shift comes, what it means to know, we find that there's very little uptake.
And is it easy to allocate, say, just the curing of a disease? That probably sounds programmatic rather than curiosity-driven. We're going to conquer this disease sort of thing. Does that push it towards it'd be suitable for a drug company to be doing that more than a professor in a department at a university?
The inevitable answer to that question is that it's a symbiosis between the two of us. And, fundamentally, universities are designed to find new knowledge. I would argue corporations are designed to take that knowledge and apply it in practical ways. But I think there is a back and forth here. We have really left to corporations many of the things that we now discover probably could be more effectively done in the university. And without continuing, a topic you want to perhaps touch later, this gets to the whole concept of a public good. Much of what we create really needs to be in the public domain, and that is really a great deficiency of corporate research.
Well, it calls to mind Jonas Salk, who famously invented the polio vaccine, and I think we actually have a tape of the revelation of that, and then his answer to the question, have you patented this? It seems eminently patentable. It's extremely useful, novel, etc. So let's see if we can hear that for a moment.
1955, a year of anxiety and triumphs. a major medical hurdle was crossed with the discovery by Dr. Jonas Salk of the anti-polio vaccine, which was to spread a mantle of protection over millions of American children.
Who owns the patent on this vaccine?
Well, the people, I would say. There is no patent. This is... Could you patent the sun?
Could you patent the sun? Asks Jonas Salk. I think today's answer is yes. Hello. But the answer in 1955, one of those years of both anxiety and triumph, was absolutely not. And maybe I should turn to you for a moment, Hopi, even wearing your basic mantle. I know that since there have been discoveries that take place in universities that could be quite profitable. Jonas Salk was said to have left $7 billion on the table by not patenting. There were inventors in 1983 of something called co-transformation, being able to put DNA into a cell, and Columbia University got a patent for that and appears to have gotten about $800 million in its campaign goal of patent fees. So suppose one of your lab members said, Eureka, do you patent it or do you publish it?
That's a great question. I think as a basic scientist, I sort of see our work as the foundation for a lot of these things that are translational. And because, our goals aren't directly, let's cure this disease, and even though sometimes there's a sort of happy byproduct of one of our discoveries that does have this translational potential, I think we don't tend to think of, patent isn't the first thing that comes up in our mind. We think about publishing this, getting it out there, and in part it's because with basic science we have less to lose in some sense, right? There's not a big pot of money at the end of the scientific project that we're going after. But there's so many, and in some sense, I think this is why basic science, in some sense, feels a little bit like we have to defend ourselves. And this is very real in the sense that there is a senator that will remain unnamed that really does keep a list, publishes a list of titles of grants that I could understand to a non-scientist would sound quite funny. The study of fruit flies in vineyards in France, right? To many of us, that sounds like, well, why should the public be paying for this? But it turns out that studying fruit flies, okay, in a vineyard, maybe not necessarily in France, we've learned a lot about alcohol metabolism, and it's a great model for understanding what's going on in humans.
It's interesting to hear that at a time when government funding for big projects, normally thought of as public good projects, like going to the moon, now there's the XPrize, and you see the means of entrepreneurship and profit to achieve big goals.
Right, and I think this XPrize is a great example of a way to incentivize, at a big level, basic research.
Yes.
There's all these great, byproducts. Like in the last year, there was this excellent, really fun publication where essentially there's the product was a material that, let's say it's bio-inspired, and it's used in simple terms to plug holes in tissues, so if you have a hole in the heart. And this material was inspired by a small parasite that lives on the scales of a fish that lives in the Indian Ocean in a coral reef. I'm not getting the details right. But you could imagine why study a parasite that feeds on the scales of fish in the Indian Ocean. Well, this is a great example. You never know.
In which case, it almost sounds like we should be studying almost anything because we never know.
Exactly.
But
Rebecca.
Jonathan, could I jump in here? Because I think there's a danger of our being sidetracked as to should I be doing basic or applied research?
Yes.
I think one of the things we must remember is the university goes after problems that have broad application. Corporations have unbelievable data now. They can do amazing research, but they're always focusing on this 6-month period. The university is asking, what's the larger question? And it's training students. So I've done a little bit of research on, what effect does the university have on the economy? And the answer is big, so this is good. But funnily enough, it's only partly through papers. It's mostly through the students. And one of the things that basic work does, and this focus on the larger questions, is train people who are going to be versatile, who are going to ask different kinds of questions. So I recently finished a book on what really drives innovation has driven innovation in the US. And what you see time after time is the diffusion of a critical group of people. They kickstart semiconductors, they kickstart electronics, they kickstart the pharmaceutical industry. And it's the students coming from this big question framing not just the individual pieces of knowledge, although they're great, don't mean to say anything, but that's just as important.
But that's,
yeah, go ahead, Alison.
So, but part of what I think Hopi is suggesting is we need the data out there, the ideas out there, so that creative people who aren't otherwise working in a lab site can use it in new ways, right? We're going to get new ideas in places we didn't think had anything to do with fruit flies as a result of having this stuff accessible.
But so far,
Can I also point out, with respect to this notion of a more programmatic and curiosity-driven agenda, if you like that, there is nobody who is more curiosity-driven and more resistant to an agenda than a graduate student. Right? So, if you ask yourself what renews universities, it's students and graduate students. And that's what's so critical. And today, I would say in our discipline, no aspect of it is more under threat than this training mission.
More or less resistant after 7 years or so?
We graduate all our students in 5.5.
Very good.
On average.
Mean or medium?
Yeah, I was just going to say.
But Alison, just before we leave this topic, let me ask you, so far it does sound as if a lot of the justification for the basic science, a lot of the success is defined through all the implications that can really help the world later.
Right.
And I'm wondering if, as our basic humanities, humanitarian, if that's the only or right metric, and secondly, what would you say is the right level of philosophers in the world?
The right level.
Yeah,
I mean,
what would be not too many,
applied?
not too few?
Oh, I think everybody is a philosopher. They need to be trained more, perhaps, in their... I mean, everybody asks the why question. That's a 3-year-old is the best example of a philosopher. You just need to ask why. And you do need to think creatively about what the options are. Being a philosopher is really just about not being stuck in your tracks and being able to think, imagine a different way of answering a question from the way you're used to answering it. But you started with the question.
Well, I started by asking about, is ultimate application to some very concrete good the way to measure the value of the basic research, or the only way?
Depends on how you think about if the question is, how should I live my life? Is that an applied question? That's one of the things we think about. You know, in some cases there are obvious applications, like when we talked about earlier, thinking about the notion of causation or an attempt.
Yes.
In law, there are applications. But in many parts of philosophy, just trying to figure out, like, how do I understand myself? So here's an example. Is this applied or not? I work on the relationship between mind and body. I teach a freshman seminar where we start by reading a little bit of psychiatry. Because you think, mind-body problem. That's a nice thing to think about if you've got the time. But what am I going to do with that? Well, unfortunately, we all know people who suffer from mental illness. And the real question arises, what kind of response do I want to that? Do I want meds? Do I want talk therapy? What's the right way to get treatment? Well, I've got to have some kind of a view about what the relationship between my mind and body is before I go forward. Do I think the advantage is only in the application? No, I think self-understanding itself is important. And a lot of what philosophy does is help us just try to understand ourselves, our position in the world, the social world, the natural world.
So we started this conversation has been looking at the differences between past, present, future with data and the amounts of data and processing. We're at a moment where we're talking about understanding, which is probably not nearly the same as data.
Right.
And of course, our title is knowledge. Right. I guess it does raise the question, how do we know that something is true? What counts as true? Yeah. And I guess there was a word...
How much time do we have?
Well, there's a word introduced that became word of the year in both 2005 and 2006. I don't know how you can do it for 2 years running. But let's hear from the person who introduced that word.
I don't trust books. They're all fact, no heart. And that brings us to tonight's word. Truthiness. We are divided between those who think with their head and those who know with their heart. The truthiness is anyone can read the news to you. I promise to feel the news at you.
So truthiness. With all of the extra data, information, stuff a click away, just as Alison was saying, it's transformed her field, doesn't have to go to Paris anymore. How do we know what's true anymore, or is it more what we feel? So, Peter, I don't know if you have thoughts on that.
Well, you know, it's an interesting thing that, obviously as a physical scientist, you know, I mean, much of what we deal with could really be considered to be a rather imprecise attempt to understand an objective reality. And I think what's interesting about the issue of truthiness is, at the moment, is not simply that we have, in many cases, rejected the outcome of that finding. I mean, take the controversy over whether the sea levels are rising. You can actually measure that effectively with a ruler, and it's been done since the mid-17th century. And yet that now has become a political controversy as to whether or not it's true. And I think what we're seeing now, particularly in the last 3 years, is not so much an attack on these objective facts, and we might decide to act on them differently, but actually on the institutions that are responsible for creating those facts. So, you know, we have in this nation at the moment a wholesale retreat from developing, funding, and promoting those institutions whose role it is, from, you know, NOAA to the NIH, whose role it is to try to ascertain objective facts. So we don't just take objective fact and then distort it as implied by truthiness. We don't even want to collect those facts in the first instance.
Alison, maybe I can put it back to you. How, in a university where we want to be able to entertain different viewpoints and be able, as you say, to be open to being wrong all the time, reconcile that form of doubt, structural doubt, with feeling like we pretty much know with the ruler what the sea level is doing?
You know, I think the real worry about this truthiness is what we're doing with the facts, the data, and so on. In other words, in a lot of areas of life, it's your job to put some kind of spin on the facts. You're a journalist, you're supposed to find the facts, but you have to present them in a way that tells a good story. You're a lawyer, you need to know what the facts are, but you're defending a client. You've got to emphasize some and de-emphasize others. I do think it's hugely important that the university remain a place where our job is to inquire disinterestedly into the truth, the facts. And it's true, sometimes we get them wrong, sometimes we get partial truths, and that's what progress is. We learn how more complicated things are.
Hopi mentioned an unnamed senator who keeps track of research that he or she deems iffy. Here is a named senator, James Inhofe, talking about global warming.
They've been cooking that science since 1998, when I first realized this thing was a hoax, and I made the statement that the notion that man-made gases, anthropogenic gases, CO2, cause global warming is probably the greatest hoax ever perpetrated on the American people.
So, Rebecca, you do study this kind of thing, yes?
I do. I do. I'm co-chair of the Business and Environment Initiative at the Business School. So I spend a fair amount of time talking to gentle people like Senator Inhofe. You know, it's interesting. He once said on television that when he first heard about the basic theory of global warming, he thought it must be true. But when he found out how much it would cost to fix, he realized it couldn't be.
That's
sort of a variant of the Upton-Sinclair rule.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I want to sort of say a word in defense of truthiness, because I think it's a phenomenon we should really understand and focus on. You know, the world is unbelievably complicated today. I mean, and there's all this science coming at you from so many different people, and it's very hard to make sense of. And some of it assaults your deepest beliefs about the way the world is, the way the world should be. And so I think as we think about the future of knowledge in the university, one of the things we should be thinking about is making those connections. I mean, I think writing the papers is unbelievably important and is core to what we do. But if we then just say, well, it's in the journals and you're stupid because you don't read them and, you know, we're the high priests, that's not what we should be doing at Harvard. We should be actively reaching out and building those bridges, because I understand. I mean, it's hard.
Yes.
I don't agree with the senator.
Yes.
Global warming, I mean, who knows what's going to happen? But I personally don't want to gamble against 98% of the climate scientists who say we have a real problem. You know, that seems to me a risky bet to take. And we should be making clear what we think the science is, but at the same time, I think we get nowhere by looking down at our noses at people who disagree. And we should be really trying to bridge that.
And do you see that as something for individual faculty to take on as part of their own responsibilities and what they answer to? Or is there something more institutionally that would evolve to, because Peter was making it sound more like a kind of pitched battle.
No, you know, one thing, just to speak to that issue, this gets back to the issue of you know, the public good. I think it's very much in common with what Rebecca is saying. I mean, much of what the university has a critical role in letting the citizenry know in a democracy that the knowledge that is created is its to have. I mean, it is not the purview of high priest. And so, for example, in my own research, as I imagine in your work, essentially all the software we develop now is open source. It can be used by anyone in the world. We do not make a proprietary claim to it. And we believe that that actually has led to enormous advances. So I would say that, quite contrary to your point, that in fact, a fundamental goal in the university has to be to get that information out there and for the citizenry to understand it is theirs to have. And here, just briefly, we have to be careful about the role of the university as actually working at cross-purpose here, which is, and this is your point with Hopi, is if we have now, for narrow economic reason, to decide we're going to patent every small discovery we make, we are in fact destroying the basis of our own legitimacy as a conduit of a greater public access to at least a form of the truth.
Got it. Alison.
I don't at all disagree with the idea that we need to get the information, the knowledge, as it were, out there. But there's a further matter. With so much information, so much knowledge, as it were, what do you do with it? Right. So what we're able to do here, I think, with our students is help them figure out, what do you do when you're hit with all this data, all this knowledge? You turn the computer on and I can't watch the news these days. There are too many things running. I can't track it. But I think our job is to help them sift through what's the reliable data, what's not the reliable data, what's an interesting thing or reasonable inference to make based on the data. And same with text. You know, I'm flooded with texts now. How do I sort it through? What's an interesting reading of a text and what's not?
Yes.
So I think there's a role for us.
Hopi?
And I think there's an analogous situation in sort of science when we think about, let's just take genomic data as an example. That is now all freely available to anyone, to our students, so forth. So the question it used to be who can generate the data. You know, who has the access to the equipment, who has the funds and so forth. But now in a lot of fields, the data's there. And so I feel like our job as educators is to teach students how to think critically and creatively. Because the people that are going to be successful are those that, you know, have access to the data like everybody else, but do something creative with that.
You know, I think this issue also of access to knowledge, it just perhaps briefly should be brought up. This whole new movement in open source publishing is very, very important because, you know, I can say in the biomedical sciences where a considerable fraction of the public tax dollar goes to support it, what we discovered a few years ago was even universities could no longer afford access to that research. And so there's been a revolution over the last 10 years in moving that so that it's free. It's free to anyone. And that's not been complete, but it's certainly a dramatic change over 350 years of previous practice.
And I would say it's even better than that, at least in the biological sciences. There's a move to put your work, make it available before it's published, before it's finished, to get comments, to start a discussion. And wow, what an appeal to that it's not just your idea, it's your idea that's then polished by all this feedback of other people as well.
It's true in the humanities too. People are putting their papers up and getting feedback before publication.
So part is a trend we're seeing then towards much more openness between university and the public, among universities. Anybody can get access to the data would be the ideal, and it sounds like we can be in the vanguard on that. And then I guess Alison's point was about critical thinking skills and such, because even if presented with everything, you may not have the tools to make sense of it.
Absolutely.
I suppose a third component might be public outreach, and I'm curious about how the work or life of the scholar, as you've experienced it, has evolved as it has gotten easier to reach people in the public. I should just do a quick test here. I'm going to play a sound, and I'm curious how many of you recognize this sound. How many people know that sound? Wow. All right, so that is the sound of a TED Talk about to start. That is a 17-minute sort of intellectual delicacy that has been honed and buffed and polished and then is offered up at very high production values. And I'm curious how you all feel about that kind of format to get audiences way beyond perhaps the 5 or 6 people I've been told have read my law review articles. Yes.
So could I start?
Yes, please.
The TED Talk is symptomatic of one of the great excitements and temptations of the academic's life. 20 years ago, you hoped you might reach a couple of hundred people, maybe a couple of thousand. Now, if your TED Talk goes viral, you reach millions. And then you write the book, and then you get the speaking invitations at $25,000, $30,000, $40,000 a time. And it's not only financially.
I know what they're going to be talking about after the panel.
It's very applied over at the business school.
Rebecca is about to be asked to do the Four Musketeers approach to speaking gigs, yes.
No, the only reason I raise the number is it changes behavior. It changes behavior. And it's not just the financial, it's the opportunity to make a difference, to have people hear your research. I mean, what could be more exciting and more fun? But you run into the temptation to simplify, to make it too easy, to spend all your time on the road, to talk to people who think, oh, you're so smart, and lose that connection to what really grounds you. And so I think it's both a great opportunity and a great danger and temptation. And that's something we really have to navigate.
And your approach is basically balanced breakfast approach, a little bit of the road, a little bit back in the academy?
I love the academy.
I hesitate to suggest the cure is a graduate student or an undergraduate student, because no greater cynic will be found for your TED Talk at $40,000 a pop than a student, who's going to come in and have her own opinion, and it's not going to be.
Yeah, it's like eating candy floss. You do too much of it, and it's like, oh, you want to be with the real ideas, and the graduate students are the real ideas.
Well, can I just add to that? In a way, we're in an unusual position now, because we have to do more than we used to have to. So we're getting increasingly specialized. That's one of the reasons we really have to package our stuff in a way that's accessible and that will reach more people, because we can talk to fewer and fewer people when we're way down in the depths of our papers. On the other hand, you don't want to throw that stuff away as though all that's there is the tip of the iceberg. Our job is to figure out the details. You wouldn't want to get rid of that stuff.
Yes.
We need to figure out the presuppositions of the things.
So Alison, may I just ask, given this desire to thread the needle between public outreach and getting one's ideas out there and keeping into the leaves on the trees in the forest, what's the right percentage of time, do you suppose, where you should be editing Wikipedia articles?
I spend zero.
Zero? Even though that Wikipedia article on that aspect of philosophy for which you might know the most of anybody in the world.
No, you're right. If I see something that's quite wrong, I will talk to somebody who knows how to edit the Wikipedia article. But I think we're spending all of our time doing that. It's a real mistake. Lots of people can, I mean, the data's there. Lots of people can do that. But we do have skills that other people don't when we're down in the trenches. And I think it's our responsibility to keep working on that.
Also, Wikipedia makes the interesting point that I think we probably all agree on, is knowledge is a process. It's not an artifact, right? I mean, knowledge doesn't live either stacked away in the libraries of yore or now on the internet. It is the process of thinking about problems, and that's really the critical role of the university. And that's why I think we always say, and we all believe it, that education and research, they're intimately coupled, and it is that very process of discovery. So were we to take all the knowledge we have today and end the university, no more future knowledge, you wouldn't be left with all the knowledge we've accumulated up until now. What we've come to learn is it would all disappear. It would, in fact, decay away till we didn't have it anymore.
You've got to keep pumping the bellows.
If you don't keep moving, if you don't keep, it takes extraordinary innovation, actually, in knowledge generation to stay where you are, never mind to move ahead.
Yes.
Can I just add to this? So I agree with everything that's been said, and this idea that the TED Talk simplifies things. But I think it's sort of deeper than the TED Talk. Even if you look at a scientific publication, you sort of read everything that went right, all the perfect experiments, and you lose all the stuff, all the, in often cases, years and years of experiments that didn't make a result that was publishable or a result. And I think that's what's so important, again, about the education process and getting students, for example, in our case, in the lab, hands-on, because they understand the process and they understand it's not, everything doesn't work towards one end. You have all of these other things that don't work, and that's part of the process.
And I think so far you've all been very good about saying how integral the students are to the research you do and how important it is to sort of pass that teaching on. I'm just curious if you've been seeing changes in the students over time that we could project out. And here's one student weighing in on the value of a college education on an internet show called The Young Turks. My guess is there's not a lot of viewership of it among us. But for those on the webcast, greetings to the Young Turks. They just passed 1 billion views for their show. And that's like McDonald's level service. But here's a quote from one of the students on the show about education.
You have to look at college as an investment. People don't go to college for enlightenment anymore. If you want enlightenment, it's called the internet, okay? Don't go to college because you want to feel smarter. It's a bad idea.
So, Rebecca, you winced first.
Oh, it's so sad to hear that. So as it just happens, I spent the last couple of weeks trying to get really up to speed on the latest climate science. And I asked my RA, well, there must be a website that has all the latest knowledge, all lined up with all the sources. I mean, it must be out there. Keep looking. Go find it. Sea level, ocean acidification, cloud cover, I want the whole thing. And they would come back and I'd say, that's not data, that's just assertions. You know, give me the data. And finally, they've come back with 200 scientific articles. You know, and those are on the website, those are on the internet. But the idea that you could navigate with no background, with no understanding of where to look, I really think it's a mistake. I mean, we should be on the net, we should be reaching out, we should be connected to the world. But the idea that you don't need training, that the real knowledge is not difficult to understand, is, I think, just really wrong.
Well, that sounds like Hopi's description of the false starts and the sleepless nights and the things that don't get published. Are the students still open to that, as best you all can tell in your respective classes?
Absolutely.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, here's one way to put the difference between going online and coming to a class here at Harvard. The net, it's one way, the internet. You're watching someone present something. If you get bored, you turn it off. And one of the advantages is supposed to be, you get bored, you turn it off, then you'll go back to it. But what you really need is somebody, a two-way street. You know, if you're getting bored, I can start challenging you in one way or another, get you engaged. If I see that you're confused, I can pause and explain. And education happens in a two-way direction. It doesn't happen just sitting in your pajamas. I mean, I could be entertaining and you can eat your popcorn while you watch me online, but that's not getting an education.
Here's another example. I think the way that many of us remember our lab courses in the sciences, so I remember going to chemistry lab and you sort of did a cookbook type of lab, and there was a prescribed answer and either you got the answer right or wrong. And I think that's changed a lot in recent years, and it's, the labs are much more discovery based. So one example in one of the courses I teach is folks can have the option of taking their own DNA sample and learning something about one of their genes that's not medically relevant, just a note. And the eyes of these students, how excited they are to learn something about themselves, and more, they discovered something new in general, is changing. And that's, again, something you're not going to be able to get off a computer screen.
You know, I don't know if you think this is within the scope of what we're talking about today. Harvard is obviously an international institution. But as we talk about knowledge, I think it's very interesting to think from the point of view of a nation or national competitiveness about how you use knowledge. Because the notion that we are the sole sort of key holders to the Library of Alexandria is gone now. I think that's what you're hearing. The knowledge is widely diffused. It is not trivial to find it on the internet or to use it. And, you know, power will flow in the future to nations and peoples who are good at empowering their citizenry to actually make use of that.
And
you know, as a nation, that's a huge plus, but it's a huge risk.
And I so far hear a lot of skepticism that that is readily done conventionally over the internet. But is it forever doomed, or is there a way to bring this through digital channels to an interactive, rich, curiosity-driven?
And I was afraid we're sounding too Luddite. I mean, I know none of us are.
Oh,
I mean, it's really important we put stuff out on the net and that we empower.
Yes.
I mean, clearly a lot more can be done over the net than is being done, but it's not just random surfing. And it's got to be done carefully. I mean, we shouldn't be giving basic lectures in accounting or, you know, there should be a whole bunch of stuff that anyone can reach on the net. And then there should be advanced courses, and we should be central in that. That's really important.
And it does sound like a lot of the skill passing on is done through an apprenticeship of sorts, regardless of field, rather than a didactic sort of, here's the information, now here's the quiz. And figuring out how to make that apprenticeship work digitally, I think, is not impossible, but tricky.
I don't know, in your own work, which has a lot of, I know, intersection with the internet, I have quite a few programmers in my research group, 5 or 6. They could, in principle, work entirely from home, right? And it could be entirely diverse. I've found that, I mean, I require them to be in the group 3 times a week at minimal, because
now you are sounding Luddite.
No, you know, they tell me that physical interaction actually substantially drives the agenda when it isn't programmatic, when you don't know where you're headed.
If it's curiosity-driven, you want to be able to have
to interact, right? And I think industry knows that.
Oh, yeah.
Wonderful to have teleconferences, but we aren't all meeting by teleconference today for a good reason.
Yes. Well, speaking of which, let's make the most of the fact that we are in the same room at the same time. I believe we actually have microphones. And if somebody has a question or a brief comment, the floor is open. This gentleman here, feel free to identify yourself, and I should, this is now the lawyer in me, alert you that this is being live streamed to an indefinite and indeterminate number of people.
Well, to the millions of people out there. I am Rick Smith, class of 74. My question is about accepted wisdom. Accepted wisdom has changed over time. Used to be that, you know, physicians would bleed patients, or people believed Newtonian physics, or even in our lifetimes, people believed that ulcers came from bad eating habits or drinking habits, as opposed to from H. pylori. So my question is, which areas of accepted wisdom today do you think are most likely to be superseded in our lifetimes?
That's a great question. Hopi, you're the basic scientist among us. What do you say?
Give me the hard one. That's a great question. I think maybe if you asked all of us, we're going to say something different. So maybe one way to think about this is to step back and say, which fields of science do we think are going to move the fastest? And I think this is where maybe some of our biases will come in. And I have to say my bias and the thing that I'm pretty excited about is neuroscience. And there's a lot of enthusiasm, obviously, within Harvard, but also outside of Harvard for this field. And so I think there are a lot of things now that are starting to come about. We were discussing some of these studies earlier. So for example, there's a lot of enthusiasm about finding genetic correlates of behavior or behavioral disorders. And so I don't know, that to me seems like an area in which we're really going to make progress. I can't think of the right analogy for what the wisdom is that we're going to sort of change, but I think that's an area I would keep an eye on.
Rebecca, any thoughts on this?
I think we're really going to change our minds about what makes us happy. We're just at the beginning of that, and I think that's really going to shift.
Is there anything in particular we can buy in the stock market anticipating the shift? Or am I still in the old mode here?
That's extra.
I see.
Well, Rebecca raises the bar quite high. I think it's going to be what makes us healthy. And you know, I think we need much, you alluded to this, in fact, much of the received wisdom about medicine is going to need to change. And one of the fundamental problems in biomedicine is that innovation drives up cost. And in every other aspect of our economy, innovation drives down cost. And so until we change that, as advanced economies, we're going to have great difficulty in dealing with health.
I'm going to be the philosopher and say all of the above, but I actually think they all have to fit together. So when Hopi said neuroscience, I thought, well, that's what I was thinking, except it can't be neuroscience alone. The neuroscientists are going to have to work with the philosophers and the psychologists to figure out what the relevant concepts are to get it all of a piece. That's likely to help us understand ourselves and what makes us happy. Health is all part of the story, too. So, I mean, actually, so our conception of ourselves, I think, is likely to change.
Other questions? Thoughts? It's usually the first question that's the hardest to elicit, not the second. Over here. And you might want to wait for the microphone so our indefinite multitudes can hear as well.
Hi, Andy Ori, class of '88. You know, we're talking about the internet, and in some ways, I feel like that's going to be so yesterday pretty quickly. And I'd love some thoughts about the next 25 years as the internet, something that's separate and distinct from me as an individual, starts to become incorporated into my life through cybernetics, through Ray Kurzweil with the singularity. We have things like autonomous decisions on drones to fire on people. What's going to happen when my thinking can be influenced because something is now part of me as opposed to distinct from me as an independent thinker?
Yes. And I maybe should hazard, just since it's squarely partly in my wheelhouse, I'll hazard an answer myself, which includes, I suppose people have been familiar with Google Glass. This is a thing you can wear over your glasses, and it can just film everything and do other functions as well. So it, for instance, could let you have a virtual concierge. So there might be somebody who knows in the world that's just really good at Googling things or otherwise searching on various other search engines. I should give a shout out to Bing, given the session that follows next. That person is ready to assist you. You've just entered Harvard Yard, but you forget what time the session today starts, and you can just communicate with essentially, to use a Star Trek reference, Uhura up in the ship while you're down, and get some guidance to steer you through where you're going. It could also mean that you could be recording everything by default as you walk around the world. And should anything interesting happen, you'll have the footage to be able to treasure, to share, which also means that something like this, while we're voluntarily webcasting it, the conception of privacy could be very different. It might be like in the Old West Saloon, you have to leave your six-shooter at the door to have the kind of sanctuary where everybody can get together. Similarly, will people in meetings be asked, you've got to sort of get rid of your kit before we can have this meeting, or hold it in a Faraday cage. And so I want to just throw it to you maybe, Alison.
Yeah, I'm just thinking our conception, coming back to our conception of ourselves is changing. I mean, there's a way in which this problem is old. You suddenly are able to wear an artificial device, and that's, how are you going to integrate that into yourself? Now our iPhones are part of ourselves, and oh my God, there's nothing worse than losing your iPhone. You really feel like you've lost yourself. I think we've been doing this all along. It's just another advance. But my question, Jonathan, is if your glasses are doing all that work that you used to have to do, what are you thinking about when you're walking around?
Yeah.
I mean, if something else is able to do it all, what are we going to be thinking about?
You know, I wonder if, I wonder if the answer to that is we will turn it off.
I think so.
Because, think about restaurants. For some reason, I was reading something about it was like, I think, mid-1960s about the future of, what restaurants would look like. And it was, highly synthetic, processed. We would all get things out of school. Remember Tang? It would be a lot of Tang.
That's true.
And in fact, what's really happened, initially in high end, but all the way now is locavores, going back to farms, growing our own food. So we may, in fact, choose to turn a lot of electronics off because it's actually rather dystopic to walk around Harvard Yard and to be told what I thought about it.
This could be a rather bimodal future because you could see at some point the city gets rid of the street signs because everybody's got their own maps anyway. When's the last time somebody went to AAA for a triptych? We've got to keep them going because we've got it.
You've been to Boston, right?
That's right. Boston
There's no
is
street signs.
So it would be seen as a sense of unilateral disarmament to try to navigate the Boston streets without the use of one of these aids.
Then you got more time to read a book.
Indeed.
Like, what are the Google Glasses going to do when you point it to some Shakespeare?
They might happily show you some Shakespeare, and then
you see the movie.
Yes, you'll see the movie too. But maybe this asks a larger question having to do with the introduction of dramatic technologies that can change things. Are there any discoveries that you think should remain undiscovered?
Oh, I think there's some clear ones that have been out in the up for discussion. And actually, there was a paper that was submitted to a prestigious journal, Science, and then there was some discussion about whether it should be published. And that was, I'm not going to get the details right, so unfortunately, this is being filmed, but I think it had to do with some sort of virus. And a group engineered a virus that was more virulent. So now the question is, it's a scientific breakthrough. They discovered how to do this, but do you want that information in the public realm?
And of course, that's a specific discovery. You could see the technological counterpart would be, we maybe had easy bake ovens with a little light bulb, or the chemistry set, which I think was designed not to be so harmless, and then tort reform happened, and now they're a little more modest in what they can do. But if you can do your own DNA printer, and I can just print out that kind of stuff, would you say that's technology that just should not be in the public eye?
You know, that's a hard question.
Why, thank you.
Let's pass that over to the philosopher.
I'm not an ethicist, but it's true. I mean, that's one reason the humanities are still so important. Technology and science raises all sorts of issues that are really humanistic issues. This is partly an ethical issue, a social issue.
Peter, do you have thoughts on this?
No, I was going to say, I mean, a lot of these questions, I mean, the case of the engineered virus or bringing back smallpox, for example, seems to cross a pretty clear line, although we could debate it. What about the possibility of the personal genome, for example, which is already here? Namely, that you could have a large amount of information on your own susceptibility to disease. In principle, that's a really good thing because you could avoid harmful behavior, you could be more effectively treated if you did get sick, and there are two obvious negatives. One of them is, of course, in the story of the oracle. What if you knew you were going to die and you had nothing to do about it? There's a very interesting philosophical question. But there's a very interesting practical question, which is you might want to know that. Do you want your insurance company to know that? So what we want to know and not know in science is intimately connected with the way we construct the legal framework of our society.
And that really links to
If I were Danish, I would want my genome to be known. Currently, as an American, I would not.
Ironically, you might need to sequence your genome to figure out if you have Danish heritage. Rebecca, thoughts on this? No. I will say, at least in law, we saw an interregnum where the internet made it really easy to copy music and distribute it. And that hadn't been so easy before. And that led to a several-year battle with the various publishing and recording industries over that, which I think has ended in a bit of a détente. A lot of people do pay for their music now, although a lot less than they did before. But we see that entire battle being repeated, I don't know if it's as tragedy or farce, with three-dimensional printing. The idea that with a 3D printer and scanner, it's possible now to just download a file for free off the internet and print out my own Harry Potter action figures, and J.K. Rowling and Scholastic books see nothing of the residual. Could you imagine that printer being networked and refusing to print out something that looks a little too much like Hermione or Harry Potter or a Nike swoosh? You've got to distort it in order to make it unswoosh-like.
Or a non-metallic firearm.
A non-metallic firearm, exactly. In fact, there, interestingly, is a project, as best I can tell, not started at a university, to accumulate the knowledge to exactly print out a plastic functioning firearm through a 3D printer. And I guess that is the other side of things.
But this raises the question. I think it's very hard to say there are areas of science we shouldn't do work in. What we do need to do work in is how we control what we have. I mean, what I worry about is the internet technologies allow us to really control our employees, our family members, our citizens. I mean, I know you think a lot about this at the Berkman Center. We're not going to be able to control a lot of these discoveries. They'll be made. But we can think a lot about what mechanisms of social and political control we can develop to do something
And
about
do you
them.
think the university may have a special role to play, not just as a generator of knowledge, but as a place that has norms of interaction that maybe aren't as controlling as elsewhere, that's about, at least, thinking about freedom and exploration?
I really hope so. I am afraid the world is going to get harder and rougher over the next 20 to 30 years. And I think one of the things the university can be is a place to step back and say, what are the things we value in the long term? How do we hold space for that we think is most important?
Yes. Yeah. Do we have one last question over here, wherever the mic finds its home?
I'm Cynthia Schneider, class of 75 and then a PhD, but in the interest of truthiness, I'm really here with my husband, Tom, from the class. I'm 75, he's 73. I have what I think is a simple question. I wonder if each of you could talk about the role of creativity in your work. I think we receive kind of mixed signals on this. On the one hand, there's all the emphasis on the STEM subjects, and yet I'm so happy to have heard so much about the humanities and creativity here. So if there is a role, could you talk about that in your work, please?
So a simple question, the way that a lawyer is just a country lawyer, about creativity and how that fits in.
Well, it's probably easiest for me, right? I'm working with text, and I need to come up with a way of understanding how these sentences make sense and fit together. I've got to be able to imagine different possibilities, different ways of understanding. It's just a part of what I do every day. Although I suspect exactly what I do has a correlate in the sciences.
Oh, absolutely. I think that creativity plays a big role in the sciences. And one maybe simple illustration of that is just think about an experiment, designing an experiment. And it's one of those things where if you design that perfect experiment, it's often not even about the result, but the design of that experiment, maybe using new technology or thinking about things in a different way. I can't think of anything more satisfying as a scientist.
So I'm reminded of the aphorism that there's a time and a place for spontaneity. For creativity, given that the students you may be exposed to have already gone through so many rigors, so many tests they've had to pass, so many ways they've had to excel that are about showing that the analytic engine is good and memory retention is good, how do you fit creativity into that? Are they already bearing it, or?
I think it's all about creativity. In science, I think it's all about creativity in the sense that lots of people can memorize facts. And you don't even have to memorize facts anymore, right? You can Google everything, Wikipedia, et cetera. It's all about designing those experiments. Thinking, or even taking a step back, it's thinking about the question. What's the big question? And that's not, it seems trite, but it's something that's really nuanced, and finding a question that you can answer is the key to science. So I think my job is all about being creative.
Peter?
I was going to point out that I think all scientists that I know live that scene in Good Will Hunting, if you'll remember, where expertise was trumped by the janitor coming in with creativity, the scene where, in fact, you could come in and solve this enormous equation on the board, right? So, creativity tends to trump expertise almost invariably in science. And it is interesting. As you look around, you often read, the newspapers are so bad at saying this, they're saying, Harvard scientists did this, and there's this sense of this huge institutional infrastructure. Those of us in the know it was a third-year graduate student who dreamed this up because he was angry with a TED Talk and decided to go in a different direction.
Well, it's easy for me. Business is all about creativity. If you keep doing the same thing, you don't go anywhere. And it's a very exciting time to be in business because the world is changing very fast. We have to build an economy that's in balance with our natural world, and one that will employ the 2 billion people who are going to join us on the planet and feed them and give them jobs. I mean, creativity is central to everything we think about.
So anything we can do to exercise the imaginations of our students is central to our mission, really.
So it does call to mind, too, I know we've heard from an economist, a geneticist, a philosopher, a biochemist. Within law, there's a certain sense of, I think, to the public at large, that creativity may not be called for. I think of the patron saint of Harvard Law School, Professor Charles Kingsfield. Do we have him here?
The study of law is something new and unfamiliar to most of you. Unlike any other schooling that you have ever known before. You teach yourselves the law, but I train your minds. You come in here with a skull full of mush, and if you survive, you leave thinking like a lawyer.
I can't tell if that's a good thing or sort of a sentence that you've just been consigned to, but I can say that we share in common among all of us being very curiosity-driven and looking with anticipation and joy, even with the challenges and perhaps some of the problems ahead, with what the university can contribute and what we can contribute to the fun, the creative advancement of knowledge in the human condition. And with that, we should turn it back over to Jim. Please join me in thanking our panelists for